Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
You know, with the passing of Pope Francis, our eyes got turned away from interesting news on the outside of the church. Francis's closest possible ally in the secular world was not Joe Biden. It wasn't an American politician. It wasn't now King Charles. It wasn't any of these kind of figures. It was a man named Klaus. It was his last name Schwab. He was the head of that World Economic Forum. One of the most controversial figures in modern world. The man who had the bad taste to dress like he was some sort of extra in Star Trek. He looked like a Cardassian the way he dressed, or like a Romulan or something. If you're familiar with Star Trek, he was weird, and he was also had some pretty gross personal things he did in his personal life. One of the things he was a big advocate for was essentially starting civilization completely over again and allowing his little group of elites to dictate to you how you would live. The day that Pope Francis passed away, Mr. Schwab announced his resignation from that economic forum. Now, this had been coming for some time. He kind of announced it early, but he made it effective immediately on the day that Francis passed away. A most strange turning of events, and you could be forgiven for thinking those two events are linked, although I don't think they are. It should surprise nobody that many people think that they were. Now, in case you're thinking that, well, maybe this economic forum has figured out that the world is turning away from listening to them and is instead moving towards back to countries being sovereign and trying to address this migrant issue and all these other things, and not listening to elites who never were elected to anything, trying to dictate to them how to solve problems in their country and on a macro scale, you would be mistaken. This is posted by a YouTuber who usually talks about angry nerd stuff. He asked this, the world is run by James Bond's rogues gallery, I swear. And he said about this, he said, looks the part of somebody that James Bond would go square off against in some modern James Bond movie. If they had continued what they were doing after Casino Royale, instead of going into some increasingly weird directions, this guy would have been the villain. That would have been the logical next guy. And they're not lying when they talk about the CEO of Nestle. You know, Nestle makes some delicious products. They also do some pretty evil things in the world. You don't have to be, I don't know, a big fan of Laudato Si or Laudate Deum, Pope Francis's famous encyclicals on care for our common home, to think that the things that Nestle is doing is evil when it comes to water and food, land. That organization has clearly not learned a thing by putting that man in charge. It's like they went out of their way to find somebody more evil than Mr. Schwab and make him the public face of their organization. Amazing that they did that. Raven Ray says he looks like he has a bionic eye. I'm assuming he had maybe an injury or an illness or something. But sometimes oftentimes our outward appearance tells us a lot about our inward state. And this evil that you see thrashing about as this wider cultural societal change seems to be happening across the West, they're not giving up. That's why they put a man like that in charge. He's used to fighting against secular authorities, governments and things, for the good of his corporation. And now they're having him bring his talents, such as they are, to that organization. Because increasingly, you might have noticed, not only in the United States, but right now there's a chance it's going to happen in Canada, a chance it's going to happen in the UK. They've been pulling extraordinary means to try to keep it from happening in France. It's happened already in Italy, in South America, it's happening there, where the population is moving from essentially the progressive vision of the future to something where their own country has its rights respected, whatever that looks like in their country. And that goes squarely against what the goals of that organization are. They want a very progressive Star Trek kind of future. That's the reason I invoked Star Trek when I first brought him up. We were talking about people who looked at Star Trek and didn't see it actually for what it actually is, which is kind of a sugar-coated dystopia, they thought after watching Star Trek that that was a good idea, and they think that that's the vision of humanity that we should pursue. I wish I was joking, but you will often hear Star Trek as the reference point for a lot of these people, with they themselves, of course, being the ones in charge of it all. People who say now human beings have no right to access free water. Okay, that's what we're dealing with. People who have a completely unhuman view of things. It's an interesting book by a Catholic writer named Jack Posobiec. You may have heard of him. He's pretty big in conservative political circles in the United States these days. He has a book called Unhumans. I highly recommend you find a copy of it if you want to understand what is going on in the church and in the West, this kind of cultural situation we've been in for decades, and the methods they use to try to achieve their ends. That book will open your eyes in a very serious way. Find it on Amazon, easy enough. The thing went to the top of the bestseller list because so many people bought it. But I'm very curious here what you have to say. Damien Killer, Star Trek equals space socialism. Right. In that scenario, it's the only time where you would see that kind of system make even remote sense, because they had solved the problem that makes socialism not feasible, which is they solved the issue of scarcity. Socialism doesn't have a good answer for scarcity, meaning limited resources. But in Star Trek, they can just fabricate any resource they really need, other than like certain minerals that they can just go to the right planet if they can find it and get for basically free. Star Trek solved scarcity. So for the fictional narrative they were telling, it was plausible. But in real life, we haven't solved scarcity. So what do we use? We use markets to deal with scarcity, markets and currency, because it's the best system we've come up with so far. Linnea points out, he resigned on the day within hours of Francis's death. It's very odd timing that. Again, you would be forgiven for thinking they are linked. They may not necessarily be linked, but you would be forgiven for thinking so. It's not unreasonable to assume so. Good idea to pick up some fasting and other practices for this conclave that's coming. That's why I showed you all those different prayer campaigns. I will have them all linked in the show notes at returntotradition.org within an hour of this going live. Please do something proactive. It's not just a time to complain, not just a time to, be relieved at the passing of the most consequential pontiff possibly since at least Paul VI. This is not the time for that. This is the time for at least to include with all that proactive prayer that the College of Cardinals will actually listen to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit does not choose the Pope. I don't know where that idea comes from. Benedict XVI tried to fight that idea, failed to squash it. We have free will. The College of Cardinals has free will. They're going to be engaging in a process that will be very political as well as spiritual. Please pray, join in some way the prayer campaign that they listen to the promptings of the Holy Spirit and actually choose a good pontiff. They choose a holy man from among their ranks, or not even from among their ranks. You don't have to be a cardinal to become pope. It just hasn't happened since like 1380 something that a pope has been elected who wasn't a cardinal first. All right, folks, I'm curious what you have to say about all of this. A lot of people are not terribly surprised about, in the live chat there, are not terribly surprised about the Economic Forum doing what it's doing. One of Francis's allied organizations, that day that he passed away. A lot of people are not surprised by that, or surprised, it seems, by the elevation of a man who is outwardly looks like a James Bond villain, which is unfortunate. Pray for his conversion, for the softening of his heart. That should be our response, including with whatever else we do, making people aware of problems or whatever. We should always be praying for the conversion of the kinds of people we have to talk about doing this stuff.
Let me know in the comments if you're doing anything for this conclave that's coming, or just in general with this kind of broader betrayal of the church we've been seeing. What you're doing as a penance. I know it's odd to talk about this, in the aftermath, right after Holy Week, and after having finished Lent, but we are Catholics. We are a fasting people. We are a people who do penance for not only our own sins, but the sins of others. So let me know what it is you are doing in light of all the things we just spoke about. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.